Okay, so following the end of the French and Indian War, okay, we're going to now start to see tensions between the colonies and the British government intensify. And over the next 13 or so years, this is eventually going to lead to the American decision to rebel and declare independence. So that's what we're going to start looking at now. So the French and Indian War, which we just got done talking about, is one of the most important causes of the American Revolution. That's important to know. A lot of people don't know that. It's not its own separate thing. I mean, it is, but at the same time, it is a direct cause of the American Revolution, because the things that led to the American Revolution would not have happened if it hadn't been for the French and Indian War that came previously. Okay, so this kind of sums up some of that. So following the French and Indian War, Britain began to tighten control over its colonies. Okay, so as I said before, the French and Indian War left England with great debt. It was one of the most expensive conflicts in their history. So because of that, Parliament now felt that the American colonies should shoulder some of that burden. In other words, pay their way. I mean, the war was partially fought for the Americans. It started in America, in their defense. Perhaps the American colonists should now pay to help support the empire that defended them, right? So what does this mean? Well, what the most immediate effect of this shift in policy was that Britain began to enforce the Navigation Acts. Now, what is that? So the Navigation Acts were a series of laws that Britain had created over the years that were designed to kind of control colonial trade. In other words, the main goal of the Navigation Acts was to make sure that British colonies were only doing trade with Britain. That's what they really wanted. They wanted all the resources and all the profit from the colonies to go to Britain. The colonists, however, for years have been trading with all kinds of countries besides Britain, and they had gotten fairly wealthy doing it. So following the French and Indian War, Britain now had started to do something that it had never done before. It actually began to enforce the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts have been in existence, but they had never been really enforced. The colonists just kind of ignored them, and everyone was just kind of content to say, okay, we're going to break the law. If no one's going to enforce the law, we'll just break it, right? Now, this is just the beginning. So the fact that Britain was enforcing the Navigation Acts is the beginning of the end of the policy of salutary neglect. Now, this is very important. Right, this policy right here, which your book does not give a lot of attention to for whatever reason, it's baffling to me. But the policy of salutary neglect is really important, right? Salutary neglect had been the status quo in the American colonies since their inception. Since Jamestown, okay, all of the colonies had existed under this policy. So what is this policy? So salutary neglect was the policy of allowing the colonies to basically run their own affairs, to govern themselves. And the reason why, it was a necessity. It was impossible for the British government to govern the colonies because of distance, right? The colonies were across this ocean. It was impossible for Parliament to pass laws and directly govern them. So because of necessity, the colonies have been allowed to elect their own governments. They pass their own taxes. Right? They raised their own militias. Right? They ran themselves. Now there was always a royal representative in the colonies, which was usually a royal governor. But the royal governor really didn't do a whole lot other than represent the crown. The colonists did everything themselves. Like I said, they elected their own people, they passed their own taxes. So one of the things I want to make clear is people don't understand this. They think, oh, the colonists were just against taxes altogether. Taxes were just completely wrong. No, that's not true. The colonists had always had taxes. Taxes are necessary. You have to have taxes. The difference is the colonies had always made their own taxes. All right? What's changing now is that salutary neglect is going to come to an end, and Parliament, the British government, is going to directly start to try and tighten control of themselves over the British colonies. And that is where the colonists are going to kind of get offended and say, no, you can't do that. You've let us exist for over 100 years and have autonomy. Now you're taking it away? They're not going to take to that too well. Okay? So the colonists are going to resent what they perceive as infringements upon their liberty. Now, you could debate whether the things that Parliament does constitute actual infringements on liberty. Okay? But Doesn't matter. The perception amongst colonists is that they had certain inalienable rights as British citizens that were now being threatened by these new laws, by the end of solitary neglect, by enforcing the Navigation Act, and so on and so forth. So this is just the beginning. But what we're going to see is throughout the 1760s and the 1770s, we're going to see a series of British policies that began to erode that solitary neglect. All right. Now here are just a few of the early ones. We're only going to cover a little bit today. These were some of the earliest policies that challenged solitary neglect. And of course, the most notable ones that people know about are taxes, right? The American Revolution had a lot to do with taxes, although it didn't entirely have to do with taxes. All right? So for example, one of the first of these policies in 1764 was the Sugar Act, which was a tax. Okay, then you had something called the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act, which allowed for British soldiers to house themselves on colonial property, which was considered to be an invasion of their privacy. I mean, British soldiers could come in and say, hey, you know what, we need to set up camp in your backyard. Deal with it. But we did not see any real significant resistance in the colonies to British policies and taxation until 1765. In 1765, we get the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act changes everything. So while, don't get me wrong, while those things that are important, I want you to know all of them. I want you to know the Sugar Act, I want you to know the Quartering Act. But the single most important British policy that was enacted at this time period that offended the colonists and caused them to really resist was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act changed everything. All right, now why? Why is the Stamp Act special, okay? The Stamp Act was special because the Stamp Act was going to be the first direct tax. The first direct tax that Parliament is going to pass on the colonies. Now that raises the question, well, what's that? What's a direct tax, right? Because you got direct taxes, but you also have indirect taxes, right? For some reason, a direct tax is just so much more egregious than an indirect tax, okay? So a direct tax, because let me explain this. The colonists, like I said before, the colonists had paid taxes their whole lives. This was not like the first time, like, oh, we're being taxed, this is weird. No, the colonists had always paid taxes. The difference was they had passed their own taxes. This was a tax not passed by the colonists, but it was passed by Parliament. All right. Now, in addition to being passed by Parliament, the Sugar Act was passed by Parliament. The colonists never rebelled against the Sugar Act in any meaningful way. They were like, okay, whatever. All right. It wasn't until the Stamp Act that they really lost their minds. Like I said, this is because it was a direct tax. Now, what is that? So a direct tax is a tax that is paid directly by you, the consumer. Right? It's in your face. When you buy something, it's like, oh, here's the tax that comes along with it. So you all have a very good example of direct taxation that you experience probably pretty regularly. What's that? Sales tax, right? You go to the store, you buy a candy bar, you look at the register, it says price, and then all of a sudden it rings up the sales tax and then adds it up, right? That's a direct tax. You, the consumer, are paying for it every time you buy something. That's a direct tax. It's in your face. You are paying that cost right there. This is different from an indirect tax. In an indirect tax, usually the tax is levied on the producer. Okay? So, for example, let's say there is a tax on candy bars, just candy bars. The candy bar manufacturer has to pay the tax. They pay the candy bar tax. This doesn't exist, obviously. Now, do you pay that tax? Well, in a roundabout way, you do. Because what happens is the producer says, well, I got to pay a tax. I'll just raise the price on the candy bar to offset my losses. See what I'm saying? So yeah, you still pay it, but do you see the tax? No, it's kind of hidden within the cost of the product. Y'all follow what I'm saying here? So here's the thing, the colonists accepted earlier taxes because they didn't really see it. It was like, okay. You really had to be really keenly aware of what cost things were. The Stamp Act required colonists to actually pay a direct tax for certain products, usually paper products. And this is the reason why they call it the Stamp Act is because in order to show that you had paid the tax, they actually put a little stamp on the item, and that showed that you had paid. So colonists were actually saying, why am I paying this new fee that I've never seen before? And then they found out, oh, it's because Parliament across the ocean is saying you have to. And they're like, well, what's the money going to? Is it going to something here, here, my own colony? No, it's just going to Parliament to do whatever they got to do with it. Colonists didn't like that. They had never done that before. So it rubbed them wrong that they were paying a direct tax. Now, I'll finish up with this, I'm almost done. Were the colonists just cheap? Right? Were they tightwads who just didn't want to give up their money? Well, I'm sure there was some of that. But that wasn't the main thing. Okay? The main thing for the colonists was, look, we don't have a problem with taxation. However, if you're going to tax us, we need to have some kind of say in that tax. In other words, you can't pass a tax on us that we didn't consent to. So how do the colonists get consent? Well, they said we need representation. Right? In Parliament, the body that actually passes the taxes, which would have been the equivalent of today, we have Congress, they have Parliament, there was no American representation. Everyone in Parliament was a British citizen from Britain. There were no American colonist representatives in Parliament. There was no one to speak on behalf of the American colonists. And the American colonists said that's not fair, because we did not actually vote in any way on these taxes. You're taxing us without our consent. All right? Now, the colonists came up with a little phrase that sums this up. That is, no taxation without representation. You can't tax us unless you grant us representation in Parliament. Okay? So yeah, the colonists didn't want to pay money, but at the same time, there was a deeper meaning behind it. Was, we demand democracy. We demand a say in anything that affects us. Now, how did Parliament respond to this? Parliament said, you do have representation. They called it virtual representation. That's a vocabulary word for this week. What is that? Well, Parliament said, everyone in Parliament is a British citizen, and they represent all British citizens, no matter where they live. So you are represented. Now, the colonists said, no, that doesn't count. All right? American colonists, we may be British citizens, but we're unique. We're our own version of British citizens. We need someone to speak specifically on our behalf because of our own interests in the region. Okay? So anyways, it's the same basis we have today. Is, we elect our representatives to go to Washington, D.C. and speak on our behalf. So whether you like the laws or not that are passed, in a roundabout way, you have consented because you are part of the electorate that sent those representatives there. Okay? What the colonists are saying is, look, you don't have our consent because we never got a say in who actually wins. So real quick, my last slide, let me just touch on this and then we'll stop. So because this new tax was so offensive to the colonists, they began to resist. And resistance took various forms. But it mostly was in the form of new organizations that were being created to discuss methods of resistance. Now, did they fight? Did they use fire? No. Well, there was some violence, actually. I take that back. There was some violence. But was there open rebellion against the crown? No. This was not yet the beginning of the American Revolution. No one wanted that yet. Okay? But we did see the organizations created, like the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty was a fairly radical organization at the time, who their primary goal was to get Britain to respect American rights. But in order to do that, they came up with ideas of how to resist imperial taxation and policies like that. Okay? So, for example, we saw the Stamp Act Congress also, which was a meeting of colonial leaders to discuss how do we get rid of this Stamp Act. They actually had a meeting to discuss specifically how do we get rid of the Stamp Act. It was that hated. Okay? So the main tactic that the colonists eventually latch onto to defeat the Stamp Act is a boycott, or what they call non-importation agreements. Non-importation agreements means the colonists said, we are not going to purchase British-made goods, which was the bulk of all the goods that existed, until they repealed the Stamp Act. So one of the early tactics that colonists learned that is effective is you got to hit them where it hurts, and that's in their pocketbook. Okay? Britain exists in many ways to make money, right? And the colonies are there to enrich Britain. If the colonies are not enriching Britain, they might rethink some of their policies. So very early on, we saw very high levels of resistance to the Stamp Act. And yes, I won't get into this today, but yes, it got pretty extreme, and it did actually take on some violence. The Sons of Liberty, which are highly revered today in our history, were a fairly extremist group. They would even borderline, in some people's eyes, a terrorist group, because they actually used violence to try to accomplish their means. They would attack tax collectors. The famous thing they used to do is they would beat up tax collectors and tar and feather them. But tar and feathering seems like it's really funny, like, oh, you're going to put tar and stick feathers on them? Well, the tar has to be pretty dang hot to be liquid form. So basically they're pouring hot tar on someone, scalding them, and then they are feathering them to embarrass them so they can no longer carry out their job in a position of authority. So they were pretty radical. So this was not all peaceful, okay? And it's only going to get more extreme as we go on. All right, so yesterday we left off, we were talking about the beginnings of taxation, and the last thing I talked about was the Stamp Act, right? So where we got to? And we talked a little about how the Stamp Act, I don't know how far I got with this class, but the Stamp Act was the first direct tax Parliament levied on the colonies. Because of that, the colonists were very resistant to it. The fact that they were being directly taxed by Parliament, the fact that they were not giving representation in that Parliament made the colonists very unhappy. So they began to kind of resist it, and the way they did that was through a number of ways. They formed organizations designed to get together and discuss tactics to get it repealed. The Sons of Liberty began organizing in the New England area, Massachusetts, Boston. They even, in some extreme instances, actually began to carry out violence against the tax collectors. It wasn't uncommon for particularly radical colonists to violently assault the tax collectors in an attempt to kind of quit them from doing their job, or they would tar and feather them, which might sound like a funny thing, but it was actually pretty barbaric. That involved pouring hot tar or pitch all over the tax collector's body, and then of course dousing them with feathers to humiliate them, because these people were in a position of authority, and now that they're humiliated, their job would be very difficult to do. So those were the more extreme examples. Now on the more kind of peaceful method, they started engaging in what they called the non-importation agreements, which were basically boycotts of British goods. And this was much more effective because the boycotts actually had a pretty severe economic effect on Britain. The fact that the American colonists were refusing to buy British goods dealt a pretty good hit to the British markets. And this actually caused Britain to now say, okay, maybe we should reconsider the Stamp Act. Okay, so what we find is ultimately, as a result of all this protest and all this resistance, Britain does end up repealing the Stamp Act, which at the time was by far the most controversial measure of taxation that had been ever directly imposed upon the colonies. So the Stamp Act was repealed, and the colonists all celebrated. Now, the celebration was a little bit premature, and the colonists were so happy about getting the Stamp Act repealed that they kind of missed the fact that at the same time that the Stamp Act was being repealed, Parliament also issued a declaration in which they said that we're going to repeal the Stamp Act. However, in the future, the colonies will submit to any other further, taxation or imperial rule. All right. So what basically Parliament was doing is Parliament was saying face. They were like, look, we're going to back down this one time, but we're not backing down from the concept of taxation in the colonies. But at the time, the colonists really didn't care because they had won at least this victory, and they were happy for the time being. All right, fast forward a little bit. As we go on, we once again do see Parliament begin to impose taxation and other controls on the colonies. The next significant series of taxes are collectively known as the Township Duties. Okay, as you can see from the bullet points up there, these taxed imports on things like paper, paint, lead, glass, tea, which are considered pretty much staples and things that the colonists absolutely had to have. All right. Now, the reasoning behind these, and this is, Parliament was trying to kind of get a little tricky here, was the British government was saying, look, we have to tax you guys because we have to pay for services that are being rendered in the colonies. So they were kind of trying to make the argument that these taxes weren't going to Britain, they were actually staying within the colonies, which wasn't entirely true, because a lot of the money was going to pay for government things in the colonies, but a lot of the money was going to pay for aspects of government that were controlled by the crown, like royal governors, salaries and things like that. And the colonists did see this, and they did resent the fact that, once again, though these taxes were in some way kind of staying at home in the colonies, which made them feel somewhat better, the taxes were also being used for royal decrees and royal decisions and royal salaries, and they didn't like that very much, because they still, once again, remember, it wasn't just about the money. Money was part of it. The main argument here was more of a philosophical one, and the idea that, look, how can you tax us if you're not going to give us representation? We have not consented through the form of elected representation. Now, in order to ensure that these taxes were being collected, Britain began to crack down a little bit more. And what they did was they now began to increase the number of officials sent to the colonies to monitor port traffic to ensure people were actually paying their taxes. People were literally at the ports boarding ships, searching cargo to make sure that if something should have been taxed, it was taxed, because there was a lot of smuggling going on, a lot of illegal trade. People were trying to avoid the taxes, so they were illegally bringing cargo ashore. Now, one of the tools, and it was very controversial, and I don't know if it's in your book or not, so I'm going to say it, make sure we have it. One of the tools that Parliament approved of to accomplish this mission were these things called writs of assistance. Okay, now you would probably better understand this term if we called it a search warrant, but it's actually not identical to what a search warrant is, and I'll explain why here in a second. But what writs of assistance were, these were official documents that gave customs officials, the people doing the searching, it gave them almost unlimited power to search colonial property, okay, and ship cargo, all right? And the colonists didn't like this very much because, of course, they felt like this was an abuse of power. They felt like this infringed upon their right to privacy. Now, why is it not a search warrant, right? Well, a search warrant, and this still applies today, by the way, if you'd like to know, a search warrant is issued by a judge, and it says, look, we think a crime's been committed, we're specifically looking for evidence of some specific crime. So, for example, if you were accused of murder, and someone said you killed someone with a gun, a search warrant would look for a gun of that caliber that was used in the murder. It's very specific. It wouldn't be, we're going to look for any illegal possessions you have. It has to be very specific, it has to be tailored to the accused crime. The writs of assistance were not like that. They were just general sweeping powers that allowed these people to basically look through all your stuff and just kind of dig around for anything they wanted. Now, the goal was to find contraband, illegal goods, and cargo that was being smuggled, but in reality, they could be used to look for anything. And the colonists were worried that this was the beginning of their civil liberties as Englishmen being eroded away by Parliament. And it wasn't, they weren't wrong. This was probably an excessive use of power by the Crown. But the Crown argued they needed these powers because they had to, stop the smuggling that was going on. Now, as I said before with the Stamp Act, okay, one of the ways colonists resisted against this was they used extra legal means, okay, illegal means, right? So most of the opposition to imperial policies, it varied from colony to colony. There was resistance in all colonies, but the most intense resistance, and you should absolutely know this, was in New England. In the New England colonies, we saw the most fierce resistance to these new British imperial policies. Probably the center of this resistance was in Boston. Okay? In Massachusetts, we saw the most intense opposition to these new policies. And once again, we saw the use of violence against anyone who might represent the Crown. Okay? But the target that was used most commonly, you saw the violence directed at, were these customs officials, these tax collectors, who were basically just doing the dirty work for the British government. But they were, a readily available symbol of what colonists viewed as oppression. So they continued to use violence against them. There's an example of tarring and feathering, and they would attack them violently. So this wasn't all peaceful protest. Okay? And arguably, you could say that a lot of these extremist organizations, which you hardly ever hear them referred to this way in American history, because of course it's American history, and we look through it through the lens as Americans. But a lot of these organizations, like the Sons of Liberty, would actually probably fit the definition of terrorism at the time, right? They were using violence and intimidation to accomplish a political means, right? But they argued that it was in the greater cause of protecting their freedoms, so they get a pass. All right? Now, was there any violence on the other side? Yes. Okay? So by the 1770s, we see a very tense and increasingly tense situation between the colonies and the parent government, Britain. And in places like Boston, where there was a lot of opposition, we saw now the deployment of British troops to keep the peace. So now colonists were increasingly incensed because now they're walking around the streets of their hometown and they're seeing soldiers on every corner there to basically police them. And the colonists felt, this was once again an infringement on their liberty. Why were they being occupied or invaded by their own country? It was crazy, right? Imagine if you walk down the street on every corner, there was, American military there to watch you. You would kind of feel a little intimidated maybe, right? So in Boston, we saw a lot of hostility. And the climax of this hostility, March 5th, 1770, we get what's called the Boston Massacre. This took place, a crowd of colonists gathered outside a customs house where they collected taxes, which was the symbol of oppression in many ways for many colonists. And they were gathered to essentially protest. And there was a small guard of British redcoat soldiers out front. And as the number in the crowd grew, it became a mob, and they began to harass these soldiers. They began to threaten them. Then they began to throw things like snowballs at them. And then they began to throw things like rocks. And many of the people in the crowd, which numbered maybe in the hundreds, were carrying clubs and things like that. So inevitably what ends up happening is the soldiers in front of the custom house, they feel threatened. Okay, they feel like the mob is getting out of control. And at some point, one soldier fires their gun, which causes a chain reaction in which several other soldiers fire their gun into the crowd. All right, this kills several colonists. And the most famous image of this event is this one. This was an engraving done by Paul Revere, who will be famous for some other stuff later. And it's kind of the thing that most Americans looked at as the depiction of the event. Okay? Now, is this famous picture entirely accurate? Probably not. Okay? One of the things is, and this is an excellent piece of propaganda, because if you look at this picture, the most interesting thing is all these guys are in a firing line. That's how people prepare for battle, right? And what's this guy over here doing? He's leading. What do you think he's doing here? What's this? What's he? He's basically, hey, give him the command to fire. And that's not exactly how it went down. This was not a planned, organized attack. I mean, even the name, they call it the Boston Massacre. That was a colonial name for it, because it implied that it was this one-sided, violent interaction. Now, clearly, there was blame to go around. Like, for example, the fact that the Redcoats actually opened fire might have been excessive, okay? But in a court of law, these soldiers were actually put on trial, and they were actually, for the most part, all but one, were exonerated of all the guilt of being involved in this. It was eventually determined that they had acted out of fear. So this was a pretty controversial event, but in the American colonies, this was seen as a deliberate act of violence by British soldiers against American colonists. So the message in the news of this spread wide throughout the colonies, and it only increased colonial resistance, to the British Empire. And this is kind of the moment things really start to get really out of control. I mean, this is the first time we saw direct violence by the Crown against colonists. Okay, whether it was warranted or not, that's up for debate, but it was certainly, it had a huge effect. Now, once again, we see retaliation. It wasn't immediate, but we see increasingly violent and destructive interactions. In 1772, we get something called the Gatsby Incident. Okay, the Gatsby was this British customs ship. It was chasing down smugglers, trying to find people who were trying to not pay their taxes. And while it was chasing a ship that was suspected of smuggling, the Gatsby ran aground off the coast of Rhode Island, got stuck in shallow water. So the colonists decided to swim out and help it by burning it. All right. Now this was a British ship. It flew under the British banner. It was part of the Royal Navy, essentially. So this was perceived back home in Britain as a direct attack on the Crown. An attack on British, property or British soldiers was an attack on Britain itself. That's at least how it was perceived. So the fact that the colonists, you don't hear much about this one. This one doesn't get as much attention as the Boston Tea Party. But arguably it's worse, right? The Boston Tea Party, the colonists did destroy private property. But this was like a direct attack, really, on the Crown itself. It doesn't get as much attention. But it did happen, and of course, as a result, there was more, feelings of hostility from within Britain, the Parliament, that the colonists were just out of control, and that they were engaged in these violent, terroristic activities. Okay, so we just keep seeing, things are slowly escalating. All right, which brings us to this. So in 1773, we get another tax. This time we get the Tea Act. This one is well known. Okay? So tea was one of the most popular drinks in the colonies. All right? And it was a major import in which colonists purchased from various places, but mostly England. So in 1773, in order to raise revenue, Britain came up with this concept to tax tea imports. Now, one of the goals of this was not only to raise revenue, but it was also to ensure the success of the British East India Tea Company by giving them a virtual monopoly over tea trade in the Americas. And the way they did this was, it was actually quite brilliant on Britain's part. It didn't work, but their idea was pretty smart. Was they would reduce the cost of tea so low, okay, even with taxing on the tea, the cost of the British East India tea in the American colonies would be so low, it was accepted that the American colonists would simply disregard the tax and just buy the tea, because it was too good a deal. Even with the tax, it was far cheaper than all the other foreign tea that was being offered. And by offering this deal, it was believed that the colonists would submit to a tax. And by submitting to that tax, Parliament would then use that as kind of a precedent to say, okay, you'll submit to other taxes. It was almost like a trap. Hey, here's this really cheap tea. Take it. Oh, you took it? Okay, you're good with taxation. We'll tax you some more. Okay? So it was pretty clever. Problem was, colonists in New England perceived everything that Parliament did at this point as being malicious and a trap. And they saw through it. Okay? So the colonists were even more incensed at the idea that Parliament was not only trying to pass a tax on them, again, without representation, but they were trying to actually slip one by them. So the extremists in New England, okay, they decided that they had to take action and deliver a message to Parliament that they will not fall for this, that we will not accept taxation without representation. This leads to the Boston Tea Party, right? So the message they decided to send to Parliament is that when these ships arrive in Boston Harbor carrying the tea, members of the Sons of Liberty, so once again, this was a fairly extreme group that were opposed to these new imperial policies. They disguised themselves as Indians, and they boarded these ships, and they seized the tea, and they, of course, dumped it overboard, destroying the contents. Right? Which, seems minor, but by today's standard, we're talking about this would have been a destruction of millions of dollars of property. So, pretty big message to send. Okay, but it was just another example of colonists in the New England area taking, kind of extreme measures to resist British imperial policy. So this is kind of considered, why is this one so famous? Why, does it, we talk about the Gatsby Incident and other ones, why does this one get so much attention? Okay, it's because of the after effect. It's because of how Britain responded. The response to the Boston Tea Party is what kind of sets us down this inevitable road towards conflict. Okay, so let's look at that. All right, so in response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament decides that the colonies need to be punished. In particular, New England, which was the kind of center of a lot of this resistance, needs to be punished. All right? So we get what are known as the coercive acts, or as they were known in the colonies, the Intolerable Acts. They are the same thing. Okay? The purpose of these acts was to coerce the colonies into submission. However, the colonists viewed them as being intolerable because they were just so punitive. All right, now there are many aspects of the Intolerable Acts, but these are the main ones. I will sum them up very quickly, and you can read about them because we have to get along, get moving. One of the controversial, probably the most controversial aspect of it was the Boston Port Bill, which shut down the Boston port, no shipping. Boston was a city built on trade. With their port shut down, it crippled them. So this was a direct attack really on the city of Boston and really New England as a whole because their commitment to trade. So that was a pretty aggressive move. The Government Act, which limited some aspects of self-government in New England, it diminished the ability of the colonists to run their own affairs a little bit more in a general way. I'm not going to get into specifics. There was a New Quartering Act, which allowed the British even greater authority to house their troops on colonist property, even in their homes. You know, British soldier could, you know, quarter himself in your home by law, and you had to just tolerate that, which was a huge invasion of privacy. And the Administration of Justice Act, which basically said that any British official who was accused of a crime in the colonies would not stand trial in the colonies, in which they might receive a jury of colonists to decide their fate. Rather, British officials had to first go home to England and be put on trial, which colonists argued wasn't fair because they'd be less likely to get a fair trial in England because they might have people there who would be more sympathetic to their cause. You know, so like the soldiers in the Boston Massacre, they were put on trial in the colonies. Under the Administration of Justice Act, they would have been shipped home to Britain to stand trial. And you can imagine a jury of peers of British subjects in Britain would probably be more sympathetic to them than Americans. However, they were exonerated, so maybe not, who knows, right? By the way, a little piece of history fact. The soldiers that were put on trial for the Boston Massacre were defended in their trial by John Adams, who was a famous patriot and went on to become president. He was actually, you know, part of the movement against Britain. However, as a lawyer, he felt the need to give them a fair trial. He actually defended them. Though he did not believe in the British cause, he defended them and got them basically exonerated from guilt. So that's kind of a neat thing. That's how, you know, committed he was to the justice system. But anyways, that's the coercive act. Okay? So this was a huge attack on New England. New England now feels like they are directly under assault. So it's not going to be surprising that New England's not going to back down. They're only going to increase their agitation to undo imperial policies. Now, I'm just going to touch on this real quick. I'll let you read about this. We don't have a lot of time. The Quebec Act was something that had actually nothing to do with the 13 English colonies. It actually had to do with the portions of French Canada that were now under British control. And it basically it kind of retooled how Britain would govern Quebec. Okay? And it allowed the French there to establish Catholicism as an official religion. So why does this matter? It really doesn't matter, but it only matters because the colonists perceived it as being an attack. At this point, everything that Britain did, colonists were like, they're out to get us. Everything's bad. Right? The Quebec Act actually wasn't that bad. It had nothing to do with the 13 English colonies. But because the colonists were looking for trouble, the fact that the government in Quebec was being more directly controlled by the British Crown and that they had established an official religion there, it caused the colonists to wonder, is this the beginning of a trend in which Britain is going to erode our liberties as well? So while the Quebec Act actually had no direct effect on the 13 colonies, it was perceived, because it came at the same time as the Intolerable Acts, essentially, it was perceived as kind of another measure by Parliament to punish the American colonies. So it only increased tensions in the colonies, whether it meant to or not. So that's why I just want to touch on that a little bit. Other than that, it's not that important. All right, so in response to all this stuff, we now see the colonies take kind of much more united action. So in 1774, we see the convening of the First Continental Congress, which was a meeting of colonial leaders to discuss what was going on between the colonies and the parent country. Now understand what this wasn't. This was not a meeting to discuss independence. This was not a meeting to discuss attacking Britain or anything like that. Okay, it was, look, Parliament is not treating us the way we want to be treated. How can we address this? Okay, that was the main goal. How can we repair the relationship between the American colonies and the parent country? That's it. Independence was not on the table yet. Okay, it takes a lot of time and effort before independence is actually something that people will come to accept. Now, one of the things that was discussed at the Continental Congress was, however, how the colonies need to work together. They need to be in constant communication with one another because we have to have a united front. And we do have to start making steps towards defense. Not offense, but we need to start taking steps that if something goes wrong and maybe a war breaks out, we can defend ourselves. So as a result of these meetings, in many of the colonies, we saw the formation of militias, which began to arm themselves and began to drill in preparation of defending ourselves against possible threats from Britain. Okay? So, ultimately, what we talk about is arming themselves in New England, And in Massachusetts, where there was the most anti-British sentiment, we see colonists now began to collect weapons and drill in preparation for possible conflict. Okay? Now, news of this in 1775 did eventually get to the British. British soldiers that were housed in Boston to keep the peace there following the Boston Tea Party. Their spies informed them that colonists are collecting weapons and storing them at a weapons depot in a place called Concord. All right? So the British military decides they're not going to wait. They're going to move out. They're going to take those weapons to not allow them to be a threat to them. All right? So the British soldiers in Boston, they set out on a march to Concord to seize these weapons. And they don't realize that this is going to be eventually the events that are going to kind of kick off the whole revolution. All right? So when the British soldiers move out to go collect these weapons, colonial spies who are monitoring British actions, they get wind of it, and they now began to make it known throughout the countryside that the British soldiers are coming to take the weapons. And this is the so-called famous ride of Paul Revere and William Dawes. Okay, which Paul Revere is mostly remembered this because there's a poem about it, but William Dawes was there too. He doesn't get any love, but he was there. So this is where they make the midnight ride to warn. Oh, here they are, the Minutemen. Of course, the Minutemen were the militia, okay, who were trained to fight on a minute's notice. So of course, our mascot is named after these Minutemen. Well, actually, we're technically named after the Minutemen missile, which is named after them. But either way, it doesn't matter. Okay, so these guys go on their midnight ride. They warn the countryside that the British are coming. Gather your arms, prepare yourselves. We must defend ourselves because, you know, the British are out to get us. All right, so what happens? So halfway to Concord, the British soldiers arrive at a place called Lexington Green, located here. And there they run into colonists, a small number of colonists who have gathered in the night, have gathered weapons, and they meet the soldiers at Lexington Green to kind of try and stop them from moving on to Concord to seize the weapons. All right. So at Lexington Green, we have this tense standoff. British soldiers are on the march. They run into these militia. Okay. There's this kind of standoff in which everyone's looking at which sides they back down. The colonists were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. So after this short kind of standoff, which everyone's kind of watching each other, wondering what's happening, the British officers they instruct the colonists to depart and allow the British soldiers on their way. And when they do not depart, someone, don't know who, fires a shot. This is known as the shot heard round the world. Okay, so at Lexington Green, April 18th, 1775, we get what is considered by many to be the first shots of the American Revolution. So someone shoots a shot, we don't know who, and of course, as expected, when one person shoots, everyone shoots. Okay? And as a result of this, the colonists are scattered, which clears the way for the British to move on to Concord. All right, so in the first engagement of the war, in a sense, that's not official, the colonists, they get the worst of it. Now the question always is, well, who fired the shot? We don't know. Okay, no one knows which side fired the shot. However, if I had to guess which side probably shot, would it be the battle-tested, well-trained redcoats, or was it the militia who had previous to this been in a tavern drinking all night in preparation? Probably the colonists fired the first shot. But regardless, it doesn't matter. Same effect. These were the first shots, and from what we hear, we probably going to get the American Revolution. So what happens next? So the redcoats go all the way to Concord. When they get to Concord, they find the weapons cache is empty. They're like, where are the guns? Oh, well, they're in the hands of the hundreds of militiamen now that are now in the surrounding countryside waiting for them. So it worked. The Minutemen were made aware of them coming. They got their guns. And what happened was now, the militia, the Minutemen, they positioned themselves all along this road, all the way back to Boston, and they're waiting. And the redcoats have to march from Concord, empty-handed now, they didn't get the guns, all the way back to Boston. And the entire way back to Boston, they are constantly under ambush and attack by the militia, who are using what at the time were referred to as Indian tactics, which means they were hiding behind trees and walls, taking a quick shot, and then what they do is they run off down the road, reload, and do it again. And the British soldiers have to march in rank and file, as they are trained to do, all the way back home to Boston. And This has a disastrous effect on them. By the time the British soldiers get back to Boston, they've lost so many men who have been either killed or wounded as a result of these ambushes that they are barely an effective. Okay, that's what I thought. Gather all your belongings. You know where to go. I'll meet you back there. Now, there is one last attempt at peace. At the Second Continental Congress, after the bullets have already started flying, we get one more attempt at peace. The Second Continental Congress forms. The express purpose of the Second Continental Congress initially was to prevent future violence. So they draw up something called the Olive Branch Petition, which they sent off to England. The Olive Branch Petition offered peace to England. Said, look, kind of the last chance. We don't want to fight. We're all Englishmen. We don't want to kill fellow Englishmen. Please just hear our cries, our pleas. Of course, when King George gets the Olive Branch Petition, famously he tears it up and declares the colonies now in rebellion. And he orders troops to be sent over to the colonies with the purpose of crushing this rebellion. Okay, we're almost done. Just last thing. We're out of time. Definitely need to read about how the Enlightenment and Enlightenment philosophers influenced the thinking of our founding fathers and their decisions to declare independence in our form of government. I'm out of time. So you should know John Locke, he's an Enlightenment philosopher, you should know some of his thinking, and how, most importantly, the Enlightenment philosophers influenced our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, so on and so forth. Okay? So look into that since I'm out of time. You got to do that. Don't blow it off.